June 1944. Normandy, France. 2 weeks after D-Day. German reconnaissance planes circled high above Allied positions, photographing troop movements and tank formations below. Their cameras captured what appeared to be a massive American armored division, hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and supply trucks positioned for an offensive. German intelligence analyzed the photographs. Officers marked maps. Orders were issued to reinforce defensive positions. Troops were diverted. Resources were redirected to counter the American threat. But the threat didn't exist. The tanks were inflatable rubber. The artillery pieces were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The trucks were props. And the soldiers maintaining this elaborate charade were not combat troops, but artists, painters, sculptors, sound engineers, and designers who had traded their brushes for something far more dangerous: the art of deception on the battlefield itself. They called themselves the Ghost Army. Officially, they were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their mission was to impersonate real American divisions, creating phantom armies that would confuse German intelligence and draw enemy forces away from actual operations. They used inflatable equipment, sound effects, fake radio transmissions, and theatrical misdirection. They were actors performing on the world's deadliest stage, where a single mistake meant not bad reviews but bullets. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the Ghost Army conducted over 20 major tactical deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They impersonated entire divisions, tens of thousands of soldiers who didn't exist. They created the illusion of massive offensives that never came. They made the Germans see armies where there were none and miss armies that were actually present. And they did all of this while armed with nothing more lethal than imagination, courage, and an absolutely brilliant lie. This is their story, the forgotten unit that fought with art instead of ammunition and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is the one that doesn't exist at all. The idea of military deception was ancient. Sun Tzu wrote about it 2,500 years ago. Hannibal used it against Rome. But what the Ghost Army would do was unprecedented in scale and sophistication. They wouldn't just deceive individual commanders on specific battlefields. They would systematically manipulate an entire intelligence apparatus, feeding the Nazi war machine false information that would shape strategic decisions across multiple fronts. The concept emerged from lessons learned in North Africa. In 1941 and 1942, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery used dummy tanks and fake supply depots to deceive German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The deceptions worked. Rommel positioned his forces based on false intelligence, leaving real British positions vulnerable to attack. Montgomery's victories at El Alamein owed as much to successful deception as to military strength. American military planners took note. If deception worked in the desert, it could work in Europe. But European deception would be more challenging. German intelligence was sophisticated. They used aerial reconnaissance, radio interception, human intelligence networks, and careful analysis. Fooling them would require not just fake equipment, but a complete theatrical production: sounds, signals, movement patterns, and behaviors that perfectly mimicked real military units. In early 1944, the U.S. Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The unit was classified top secret. Its approximately 1,100 soldiers were handpicked for unusual skills. Instead of seeking experienced combat veterans, recruiters looked for artists, designers, actors, and sound engineers. They visited art schools and advertising agencies. They recruited from radio stations and theater companies. They found men who could paint, sculpt, design, perform, and improvise. The roster read like a who's who of American creativity: fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, photographer Art Kane, dozens of commercial artists who would later become successful in advertising and entertainment. These men weren't trained killers. Many had never fired a weapon, but they understood illusion, misdirection, and how to create convincing fakery under pressure. And that's exactly what the Army needed. If you're captivated by the hidden stories of how creativity and courage won impossible battles, subscribe to Retro Files and discover the classified operations that changed history. The Ghost Army's arsenal was unlike anything in military history. Their primary weapons were inflatable decoys, rubber tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that could be inflated in minutes using air compressors. When properly positioned and camouflaged, these inflatables looked remarkably realistic from the air. They had the correct shapes, sizes, and even unit markings. A German reconnaissance pilot flying at 10,000 feet couldn't distinguish inflatable tanks from real ones. But visual deception alone wasn't enough. Real military units generated sounds, engines, voices, equipment movement. The Ghost Army developed sonic deception, recordings of tank engines, troop movements, and construction activity. These recordings were played through massive speakers mounted on trucks, creating the auditory impression of military activity. The speakers could project sound over 15 miles. German listening posts would hear what sounded like an armored division moving into position and report accordingly. Radio deception was equally crucial. Real military units generated constant radio traffic, orders, reports, logistical coordination. German intelligence intercepted and analyzed this traffic, using it to track unit locations and strengths. The Ghost Army created false radio networks, broadcasting scripted conversations and fake orders using proper military codes and procedures. They even developed recognizable fists, the distinctive keying patterns of individual radio operators, so German analysts would believe they were tracking the same units over time. The final element was special effects, theatrical misdirection on a massive scale. Ghost Army soldiers would arrive in towns near the front wearing the shoulder patches of divisions they were impersonating. They would visit bars and restaurants, deliberately talking loudly about their unit and upcoming operations, knowing that local civilians might be German informants or that their conversations might be overheard. They would drive vehicles through towns displaying unit insignia. They created all the visible signs of a major military presence. Training was intensive and unusual. The men learned not just to operate equipment, but to act, to behave like the units they were impersonating. They studied how real armored divisions organized their camps, how they moved, how they communicated. They practiced setting up fake command posts, positioning inflatable equipment realistically, and coordinating complex multi-element deceptions. And they learned to work fast. Most deceptions had to be established within 24 hours. Security was absolute. Ghost Army soldiers were forbidden from discussing their work, even with other American troops. They carried false identity papers listing fake units. If captured, they were to reveal nothing, though everyone understood that being captured while impersonating a combat unit would likely mean execution as spies rather than treatment as prisoners of war. The risk was enormous and constant. In June 1944, the Ghost Army shipped to England as D-Day approached. They didn't participate in the invasion itself, but prepared to support operations once Allied forces were established in France. On June 15th, they landed in Normandy. The real work was about to begin. Their first major operation, Operation Elephant, began in late June near the town of Treviers. The Ghost Army impersonated the 2nd Armored Division, creating the illusion that a major armored force was positioned for an attack. They inflated rubber tanks and positioned them in fields. They broadcast tank sounds through speakers. They transmitted radio traffic suggesting preparations for an offensive. The deception lasted 4 days, during which German forces remained fixed in place, expecting an attack that never came. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored Division was elsewhere, preparing for the breakout from Normandy. Operation Elephant established patterns that would be repeated throughout the campaign. The Ghost Army would arrive quickly, set up their elaborate stage set, maintain the illusion for days, then vanish overnight. They operated close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. They worked exposed, vulnerable, hoping German forces would believe the deception long enough for real operations to succeed elsewhere. The men understood the stakes. If the Germans discovered the deception, they would attack what they believed was a lightly defended position. The Ghost Army had minimal actual combat power. In a real firefight, they would be quickly overwhelmed. Every mission was a calculated gamble, betting that their illusions were convincing enough to prevent the Germans from testing. As summer turned to autumn in 1944, the Ghost Army refined their craft. Each operation taught new lessons. They learned that Germans studied not just what equipment was present, but how it was positioned. Real tank units didn't park tanks in perfect rows. They dispersed them irregularly for protection. The Ghost Army began positioning their inflatables more realistically, adding tire tracks with actual vehicles, creating muddy areas where tanks would have churned up ground. Even leaving trash, empty ration containers, and cigarette butts around fake positions. They discovered that small details mattered enormously. Real soldiers left footprints. So Ghost Army members would deliberately walk around inflatable positions, creating trails that would be visible in aerial photographs. Real units erected latrines and garbage pits. The Ghost Army dug fake ones. Real units strung communication wires between command posts. The Ghost Army strung wires that went nowhere. Every detail added authenticity to the illusion. The sonic deception team became increasingly sophisticated. They didn't just play recordings of tank engines. They created complete soundscapes. Tanks starting up in sequence, as if a unit was preparing to move. Bulldozers clearing obstacles. Trucks arriving with supplies. Shouted commands. The sounds were timed to match what would actually occur if a real unit was preparing for combat. German listening posts would report hearing precisely what they expected to hear, confirming the visual deception. One of their most successful operations came in September 1944 near Brest, France. The Ghost Army impersonated the 6th Armored Division while the real 6th Armored was engaged elsewhere. For 2 weeks, the Ghost Army maintained the deception, convincing German forces that a major armored unit was positioned nearby. German commanders kept troops in Brest to counter this threat, preventing them from reinforcing other positions where real American forces were attacking. When Brest finally fell, captured German officers expressed surprise that the 6th Armored hadn't participated. They had been tracking it on their maps the entire time, never realizing they were monitoring ghosts. But the work was exhausting and dangerous. Setting up a full deception required backbreaking labor. Inflatable tanks weighed about 85 pounds each and required 2 men to move and position. Sonic equipment was heavy and had to be transported and set up quickly. Radio operators worked 12-hour shifts, maintaining constant transmissions. Visual deception teams worked through the night, positioning equipment under blackout conditions. And all of this happened within range of German artillery. Shells occasionally landed near Ghost Army positions. Men were wounded. A few were killed. For more incredible stories of unconventional warriors who changed the course of history through courage and creativity, subscribe to Retro Files and uncover the classified missions that have remained hidden for decades. The psychological strain was unique. Combat soldiers faced clear dangers, but also had weapons to fight back. Ghost Army soldiers were essentially unarmed targets, relying entirely on deception for survival. They had to maintain their disguise perfectly, knowing that any mistake might expose them and bring down German attacks they couldn't resist. The stress of sustained pretense, combined with proximity to actual combat, wore on everyone. Yet morale remained surprisingly high. The men understood the importance of their mission. Every successful deception potentially saved lives, drawing German forces away from real operations, preventing reinforcements from reaching critical battles, or forcing Germans to waste resources countering threats that didn't exist. The Ghost Army's theatrical background helped. They treated operations as performances, taking professional pride in executing deceptions convincingly. After operations, they would critique their own work like theater directors reviewing a play, identifying what worked and what needed improvement. The artists among them continued creating art when possible. They sketched and painted the French countryside, combat scenes, and portraits of fellow soldiers. Some of this artwork documented their unusual war, paintings of inflatable tanks being positioned, sketches of sonic equipment trucks, portraits of men in costume playing roles. But most artwork was classified and couldn't be shown publicly. The Ghost Army's war was secret, and so was their art. One operation in October 1944 demonstrated the Ghost Army's increasing sophistication. Operation Bettenburg required them to simulate the 5th Armored Division and the 90th Infantry Division simultaneously, making the Germans believe 2 divisions were positioned in Luxembourg when neither was actually present. This required coordinating visual, sonic, and radio deceptions across a wide area, maintaining separate but complementary illusions that would reinforce each other. The operation succeeded. German intelligence reported both divisions in Luxembourg, exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them to believe American forces were positioned. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was brutal. The Ghost Army operated through freezing temperatures and snow. Inflatable equipment was harder to manage in cold. Rubber became stiff and prone to tearing. Speakers and radio equipment malfunctioned in freezing conditions. The men lived in tents without heat, sleeping in multiple layers of clothing, constantly cold and exhausted. But operations continued. The war didn't pause for weather, and neither did deception. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. The attack caught Allied forces off guard and created a dangerous bulge in the front lines. American forces scrambled to contain the breakthrough. The Ghost Army was thrown into the chaos, conducting rapid deceptions to confuse German intelligence about American defensive positions and reinforcements. Operations during the bulge were hasty and incomplete, sometimes just radio deceptions or small-scale visual elements. But every bit of confusion helped slow German advances while real American forces regrouped. During one particularly dangerous operation in Luxembourg, the Ghost Army impersonated the 75th Infantry Division to make Germans believe American defenses were stronger than they actually were. The deception worked, but German artillery shelled the area heavily. Several Ghost Army soldiers were wounded. Equipment was destroyed, but the illusion held long enough for real reinforcements to arrive. The men who had painted fake armies found themselves in real combat, crouching in foxholes while shells exploded nearby, praying their theatrical skills would keep them alive one more day. By January 1945, the bulge was contained and Allied forces resumed their advance into Germany. The Ghost Army continued operating, now conducting deceptions on German soil. The operations became more complex because German forces were closer to their own intelligence networks and communication centers. Deceptions had to be even more convincing because Germans could verify information more quickly. One remarkable operation in March 1945 supported the Rhine River crossing, one of the war's final major obstacles. The Ghost Army created an elaborate deception, making Germans believe the main crossing would occur at one location, while the real crossing happened elsewhere. They positioned inflatable artillery, broadcast sounds of bridge construction, and generated enormous radio traffic suggesting preparations for a major assault. German forces reinforced the fake crossing site, moving troops and artillery away from the actual crossing point. When real American forces crossed the Rhine at the actual location, they encountered weaker opposition than expected. The deception had worked perfectly. Throughout all these operations, the Ghost Army maintained absolute secrecy. They never told local civilians what they were doing. They didn't discuss operations with other American units unless necessary. When they impersonated specific divisions, they wore those units' shoulder patches and insignia, but avoided detailed conversations with anyone who might ask questions they couldn't answer convincingly. The men became expert at deflecting curiosity with vague responses and changing the subject. The psychological complexity of their work was extraordinary. They were performing for an invisible audience, German intelligence analysts who would never meet them, never see them directly, but would study photographs, intercept radio transmissions, and read reports from spies and reconnaissance. The Ghost Army had to imagine how Germans would interpret every detail, what would seem authentic and what would raise suspicions. It was method acting on a strategic scale where the audience held their lives in their hands. The longer the war continued, the more sophisticated German intelligence became at detecting deceptions. The Ghost Army had to constantly evolve their techniques. They introduced new elements, simulated convoy movements, fake supply dumps, bogus ammunition stockpiles. They varied their patterns so Germans couldn't predict where or when deceptions would occur. They even conducted double deceptions, creating fake evidence that would be deliberately discovered, causing Germans to believe they had detected a deception when in fact they had found exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to find. The irony wasn't lost on the men. They were artists and designers who in peacetime created advertisements, paintings, and entertainment. Now they were creating the most consequential art of their lives. Illusions designed not to sell products or please gallery visitors, but to mislead a deadly enemy and save soldiers' lives. Their canvases were battlefields. Their audience was hostile. and the stakes couldn't be higher. Yet they approached the work with the same creative intensity they would bring to any artistic challenge, treating military deception as the ultimate creative problem to solve. By spring 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied forces advanced from west and east, squeezing German defenders into an ever-shrinking territory. The Ghost Army conducted their final operations in March and April, continuing to create phantom divisions and fake offensives even as victory became inevitable. The last operation occurred in late March near the Rhine. By April, the men themselves largely kept silent. They had been sworn to secrecy and took those oaths seriously. Some didn't even tell their spouses. The war became a closed chapter, something they had experienced but couldn't fully share. They returned to their careers, many achieving significant success. Bill Blass became a fashion icon. Ellsworth Kelly became a celebrated abstract artist. Art Kane photographed some of the 20th century's most famous images. But none of them could publicly discuss the most dramatic chapter of their lives. To discover more classified stories that remained hidden for generations, subscribe to Retro Files and explore the secret operations that shaped history from the shadows. Occasionally, hints would surface. In the 1970s and 1980s, a few veterans began cautiously discussing their experiences. Jack Macy, who served in the Ghost Army's camouflage unit, gave interviews mentioning military deception work. Harold Dahl, a radio operator, wrote about creating false radio networks. But these accounts were fragmentary and drew little attention. The full story remained hidden. The real breakthrough came in the 1990s when the Ghost Army's operations were finally declassified. Military historians gained access to previously sealed documents. They discovered operational reports, photographs, and detailed accounts of the unit's activities. The scale and sophistication of what the Ghost Army accomplished astonished researchers. Here was a unit that had conducted elaborate deceptions across multiple countries for nearly a year, impersonating entire divisions, and somehow the story had been almost completely unknown. Rick Bayer, a documentary filmmaker, learned about the Ghost Army in the mid-2000s and became obsessed with telling their story. He tracked down surviving veterans, by then in their 80s and 90s, and recorded their memories. Many were finally able to discuss experiences they had kept secret for 60 years. The relief was palpable. They could finally talk about the work they had done, the dangers they had faced, and the pride they felt in their unusual service. Bayer's 2013 documentary, The Ghost Army, brought the story to public attention for the first time. Audiences were astonished. Most people had never heard of military deception on this scale. The idea that artists and designers had fought World War II with inflatable tanks and sound effects seemed almost comical, yet the more people learned, the more impressive the accomplishment became. The Ghost Army had operated at the intersection of art, engineering, psychology, and warfare, a unique combination that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. The public response vindicated the veterans. For decades, they had wondered whether their work had mattered, whether anyone would care about what they had done. Now they were being recognized as heroes. Unconventional heroes who had fought with creativity rather than weapons, but heroes nonetheless. Several veterans were invited to speak at military academies and museums. They were honored by military organizations. In 2022, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. By then, only a handful of veterans remained alive to receive it, but the recognition came at last. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their specific operations. They pioneered techniques in military deception that influenced Cold War strategy and continue to influence military doctrine today. Modern military forces use sophisticated deception, everything from decoy radar emitters to fake communications networks, to confuse adversaries. The principles the Ghost Army established, coordinating visual, audio, and electronic deceptions to create convincing illusions, remain fundamental to contemporary deception operations. But the Ghost Army story also raises profound questions about the nature of warfare and the relationship between truth and survival. War is often portrayed as a contest of strength, courage, and firepower. The Ghost Army proved that deception could be equally powerful. They demonstrated that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is not to destroy their forces, but to confuse their intelligence so thoroughly that they make fatal strategic errors. This approach had ethical dimensions that troubled some observers. Was it honorable to fight with lies? Were the Ghost Army's methods fundamentally different from the propaganda and misinformation that all sides used during the war? The men themselves generally viewed their work pragmatically. They were given an impossible mission: impersonate entire divisions with minimal resources while operating near enemy forces, and they accomplished it using the tools available. If those tools were inflatable tanks and recorded sound effects rather than rifles and artillery, that didn't make their service less valuable or their courage less real. The Ghost Army also challenged assumptions about what kinds of people succeed in warfare. Military culture traditionally valued physical strength, aggression, and combat skills. The Ghost Army succeeded through creativity, attention to detail, and psychological insight. They were artists, not warriors. Yet they performed brilliantly in one of history's most demanding conflicts. Their success suggested that war required more diverse talents than military culture typically acknowledged. The unit's composition was remarkable in other ways. Unlike most military units, the Ghost Army included numerous soldiers who were Jewish, gay, or otherwise outside the military mainstream. In an era when discrimination was legal and widespread, the Ghost Army was unusually diverse and accepting. Skills mattered more than background. If you could paint, design, or perform convincingly, you belonged. This inclusive culture contributed to the unit's effectiveness and created bonds among the men that lasted decades. Looking back, the Ghost Army's operations seem almost surreal, a combination of theater, art, engineering, and warfare that defied normal military categories. The image of artists inflating rubber tanks while enemy forces watched from miles away, believing they were observing real armored divisions, captures something profound about the nature of perception and reality. What is real? What is illusion? The Ghost Army proved that in war, as in art, the distinction often depends entirely on the audience's perspective. The equipment they used, inflatable tanks, portable speakers, radio sets, seems primitive by today's standards. Modern military deception uses drones, electronic warfare, cyber operations, and sophisticated simulation technology. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Create a convincing illusion. Maintain it consistently across multiple channels. Anticipate how the enemy will interpret evidence. And never let them discover the truth until it's too late to matter. The personal cost of Ghost Army service was subtle but real. The men returned from war unable to discuss their experiences. They carried memories of danger, exhaustion, and stress, but couldn't explain where those memories came from. Some struggled with the disconnect between their dramatic wartime experiences and their inability to share those experiences. Others were haunted by the knowledge that their deceptions, while successful, had contributed to German soldiers' deaths. Men who died because German commanders made decisions based on false intelligence the Ghost Army provided. But most Ghost Army veterans viewed their service with pride and satisfaction. They had been given an extraordinary challenge and met it successfully. They had served their country in a unique way that utilized their special talents. And they had helped end the war without firing shots or inflicting direct violence. For artists forced into military service, the Ghost Army offered an opportunity to contribute meaningfully without betraying their fundamental nature as creators rather than destroyers. The Ghost Army story also illuminates a broader truth about World War II. The war is often remembered through its most dramatic moments: D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the atomic bombs. But thousands of less dramatic operations, many still classified or forgotten, collectively determined the war's outcome. The Ghost Army represents all those invisible contributions: the support units, the intelligence analysts, the code breakers, and countless others whose work was essential but unglamorous, dangerous but unrecognized. One of the most poignant aspects of the Ghost Army's story is how nearly it was lost entirely. If the operations had remained classified another decade or two, all the veterans would have died without telling their stories. The unit would have been a footnote in classified documents, known only to military historians with proper security clearances. Future generations would never have learned that artists and designers fought World War II with creativity, courage, and inflatable tanks. The fact that the story was finally told, that surviving veterans lived to see recognition seems almost miraculous. It happened because a few veterans began cautiously sharing memories, because military documents were declassified, and because people like Rick Bayer recognized the story's importance and worked to preserve it. Without those contingencies, the Ghost Army would have remained what they pretended to be during the war: ghosts, invisible and forgotten. Today, the Ghost Army's legacy lives in museums, documentaries, and the Congressional Gold Medal awarded in their honor. Their story has been told in books, films, and exhibitions. Some of the art they created during the war, the sketches and paintings that documented their unusual service, has been displayed publicly for the first time. And historians continue researching their operations, discovering